If you think about the word propaganda, what image comes to your mind? Perhaps these posters? Or maybe these newspapers? What about textbooks? How many of you in here have studied history using a textbook before? Show of hands, please. Thank you. Looking around the room, it seems quite a high number. For many of us, textbooks are often a trustworthy source of information. The traditional question we ask when we study history is, what happened in the past? But I think a more urgent question is, who chooses how and what we learn in history? Since the beginning of national school systems, the teaching of history to promote national pride has always been a high priority for many countries, including my own, which is South Korea. Of course, teaching kids a sense of patriotism is not a bad thing at all. However, it could turn into a problem when the textbook gets swayed by a certain ideology. Regrettably, textbooks could function as a medium of propaganda instead of a purely educational tool. In most countries, the government is made up of people from the older generations. In Korea, it's been the case for a long time where the older generation in power continues to favor the traditional ways of educating young kids. For instance, history is often called 암기 과목 by many Korean students. 암기 과목 literally means a subject of rote memorization. Some students even go as far as memorizing the whole textbook, line by line, as this is usually the best way to achieve good grades. The Korean national curriculum heavily relies on standardized tests and standardized textbooks. Thus, students do not have any extrinsic reasons to change how they learn. And as a result, students suffer in a horrible competition. At the same time, are easily shaped into obedient citizens, since there is no room for diverse discourse and debate. And this lack of meaningful discussions in society brings detrimental effects. For instance, it can mean that the unheard voices of the past can forever be unheard. One case showing this is a comfort woman. During World War II, over 200,000 young Korean girls were kidnapped into different soldiers' comfort stations. They were lied to and were forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese military and were called comfort women. They were girls like me and my age, or some even as young as 10-year-olds. Comfort women is a well-known issue that many consider it to be a war crime. Unfortunately, such tragedy diminished into a politically charged topic due to a complicated relationship between Japan and Korea. And would you believe if I were to tell you that a history textbook actually became a medium of propaganda to minimize this horrifying history? In 2015, President Park Geun-hye and our Conservative Party decided to change all history textbooks to be directly government published. When the first draft of the textbook was out, many Koreans were angry and shocked. They were afraid that this could serve as a base for a particular ideology and a biased resource to serve the government's interests. It was discovered that in one version of the history textbook, the word comfort woman was completely erased, and instead were replaced with, among those, there were women who were taken into battlefields and suffered pain by the Japanese soldiers. And this was the only mention in the entire textbook. Thus, lack of mention angered many Korean citizens because it signified how pro-Japan the government was and also demonstrated how political motives of the government were getting in the way of teaching students hard facts. People also pointed out that the new history textbook draft contained biased information towards the president's father, Park Chung-hee, who was also a dictator in Korea for over 18 years. Critiques argued that the textbook draft downplays the dictatorial control and his abuse of human rights, while emphasizing his industrial and economic developments in a positive note. The blue box on the left contains information about his positive contributions to the country, while only the red box on the right acknowledges his dictatorial control. Strong opposition from Koreans followed after the draft was released, forcing the government to reluctantly make superficial changes. The revised history textbooks soon became published and were forced to be utilized all over the country, leading to many protests. It took numerous protests and also the impeachment of President Park for the Ministry of Education to decide that these textbooks would only be optional for each school. Although the government's plan failed in the end, it showed the potential of how easily history can be manipulated just for the sake of a political agenda. Now, from listening to all of this, you might think, well, this only applies to Korea. Textbooks in my home country aren't like this. But we need to always keep in mind that textbooks can be an easy target to manipulate and to subtly change our ideology, especially for vulnerable students that might lack the ability to judge. It's already been an emerging problem in many other countries, such as the US, Canada, Russia, Japan, China, and more. The problem can become apparent any day if one with power decides to influence how we think. I've been lucky to live internationally and experience different kinds of education where I was free to do my own research and develop my own opinions. And I believe that part of the purpose of learning history is to learn how to distinguish between the true or the false for ourselves, to criticize and to analyze. Textbooks should not decide which information is more valuable than others. Students should be able to do that. Students should be able to wonder why we're learning this in history rather than simple pieces of facts. And that is the ideal education I'm looking for. Unfortunately, I know that I'll be entering a system that requires conformity once again as I go back to Korea. However, the society could change if we all become aware of the importance of correct history education. It could be different if we all get engaged with the changes government make. It could be different if people learn that everyone has a voice. We need to stop thinking that history is just another subject that school makes us learn, but rather acknowledge that history is alive right now, and it is exercising its power by influencing the past, present, and the future. So now, when I ask who chooses how and what we learn in history, perhaps the answer should be we choose to critically evaluate and examine what we learn in history instead of blindly accepting in order to conform. Thank you.